For all of us as statisticians, what better time has there ever been to be part of our community, and particularly to be part of the RSS? We are the scientists who deal in data that has suddenly become not scarce, but completely ubiquitous. The raw material for our work is literally everywhere, all around us. The needs for us to mobilise that data, to understand the world better, to ensure that better decisions are made, has never been greater. And the need to stand up against poor uses of data is ever present in the media, in politics, in business, in universities, everywhere. So this really is a time where those that get stats get on, and those that don't either get left behind or get screwed. This really is a time for our community to stand up and be proud, and this conference is the best possible way of doing that. But why doesn't it feel so joyous all the time in our day jobs? Why doesn't it feel so joyous when we're on holiday thinking about it? Why doesn't it feel so joyous when we pick up our newspapers and find something else to rail about? I think partly because of a same old story, but a same old story with a new twist. It's the same old story that Richard Dole and Austin Bradford Hill came up with when they demonstrated the connection between smoking and lung cancer. The evidence shows this is not good for you. Surely everyone will immediately stop smoking and realise there are better ways to pass your lives. And there are massive risks in carrying on like this. No, it was decades. The evidence argument in some ways is still not won. There are still ever more efforts from the government and others to make people think twice. So why is that? The industry threw up all kinds of counter reasons, their own evidence. They tried to make themselves look ethical by investing in research in all kinds of topics, apart from lung cancer. People liked smoking. How could you possibly challenge our way of life? Years became decades. People kept dying. The statistical job seemed to be done, but the public health job took much, much longer. More recently, I think the story of American football is almost more compelling. That statisticians who realised that tens of thousands of concussions on the head was likely to turn your brain to mush, and American footballers were committing suicide in strange numbers some years after they had quit the sport. But that was nothing to do with American football. That was possibly due to the withdrawal of not doing American football anymore. It was making them depressed. The statistical evidence was seen as un-American. Statisticians actually challenging our way of life that we hold dear. How dare they? And if you haven't seen the film Concussion, Will Smith stars in it as the kind of evidence guy, it's worth a look. But it shows the vast personal threats and pain he went through to make sure his statistical evidence cut through. And there were rule changes that made American football a little bit more safe, or at least made sure that the risks were known. And don't get me started on climate science. Battle is still not won. Battle still needs to be taken every day to make sure the evidence is accepted and understood. But each day, the problem seems to get worse. The advent of social media has allowed people to make up news, to pick the selective thing that may be valid in its own right, but out of context is completely incorrect in giving you an unbiased view of the subject you're thinking about. Indeed, any kind of evidence that challenges the accepted view that you already have is somehow seen to be the work of some dastardly expert who's trying to do you down rather than help you on your way. How could it come to be that the only idea of scientific progress that you will accept be something that confirms what we already knew? What kind of perversion has happened here? And the social media bubbles are such that we become increasingly unaware that there are different worlds we need to contrast with our own. Increasingly unsympathetic with people who are outside our tribe. Increasingly less tolerant of those who are different to us or think in a different way. Despite this massive ubiquity of data, you have people like Robert Proctor, an historian at Stanford, who actually describes this time as the age of ignorance. Shankar Vedantam, science writer, picked up on the state we are in, saying we are flailing in the quicksands of deception. This doesn't feel like a joyous time to be a statistician in that kind of environment. But I reject that thesis. And I go more with Daniel Engber, a columnist, who says, the end of facts is not a fact. So what is going on? Two straightforward home truths I'll start with. The first one is we are trying to come up with evidence that impacts on people. And people behave in all kinds of ways, driven by their biology. They need to eat. Their feelings of being too hot, too cold, their sex drives, whatever it is. Biology is the basic driver of a lot of what we do. We are driven by what we believe, what for all kinds of reasons we think is right and wrong. And we're particularly driven by our emotions, what we feel about something. And it's only on a good day that we let our rational, evidence-based heads rule our often wayward hearts. What Daniel Kahneman would say, balancing thinking fast with thinking slow. So I think first thing we need to do is remember that people are human, and we shouldn't expect evidence immediately to be understood and acted upon. The second thing to bear in mind is that statistical insight is information, and information is always connected with power, and the powerful like to keep hold of that power. And throughout history, the role of statistics, indeed the very word, comes from the word state, the connection between the power of numbers and the power of control over societies. Think of the ancient censuses, think of the Doomsday Book, think of the way the church and the state have used numbers to exert their control over the population. That's the history of our discipline. And it only flipped into the kind of nice, fluffy thing that it is today, actually nice, hard, not fluffy at all thing it is today. My trace back, in fact, my hero in this story is John Sinclair, Scotsman, who in the 18th century was travelling around Germany and discovered the word Statistik. That was being used by the emperor to assemble knowledge that enabled the emperor to stay in control. And he came back to Britain after his tours in Germany and said, I've discovered this word statistics. I think we can have it in Britain too, because I think it will improve the quantum of happiness of the people. It's a lovely modern phrase. John Sinclair was one of the founding members of the Royal Statistical Society. And he and those friends around him in the early part of the 19th century willed what we cherish today into being. But it was against the backdrop of this dynamic between numbers and power. So rolling forward a couple of hundred years since those early days of the RSS, the defining year in my lexicon is 1989, when the internet was first demonstrated and the Berlin Wall came down. Now there's a lovely linkage between those two things. A kind of rediscovery of the value of democracy and a tool through which this information revolution could be democratised. And in the UK, interestingly, we were one of the first to pick it up. The Conservative government at the early 1990s had a thing called the Citizens' Charter, had a push towards open government. And within that push was a very special place for statistics. This was a way of giving citizens the information they needed in order to hold the powerful to account, in order to be more empowered in their own lives. Picked up later by the Labour government, their package of constitutional reform measures that included freedom of information, included devolution for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, included the creation of Mayor of London, also included the need to place on a statutory footing a system of official statistics that was impervious to influence. That manifesto of constitutional reform created the post that I now hold as something that is in statute and is designed to be independent, to stand up against these forces, the powerful, who might wish to use information for their own interests rather than for the public good. So that's a little bit of background. So why are we in such a mess? Straightforwardly, fake news sells. Hansen Ola Rosling, who I think many will have encountered, and Hans's death I think is a great loss to our community, did these wonderful experiments that showed on almost any topic people are more stupid than chimps. Given 3 alternative answers for a particular area of knowledge: how long do girls stay in school? What is happening to the population of the world? Chimps do better than people. We have internalised a systematically wrong view of the world. If anyone saw Bobby Duffy's latest Index of Ignorance report that came out a week or so ago, it is pretty startling. Our view of the world is absolutely contrary to what the real evidence would suggest. And that's because we have bought many of these fake news stories. We love the bacon sandwiches kill you story. We connive with the media in stories that accentuate extremes to such an extent that the worldview we get is systematically doctored. We say yes, yes, yes when we see an advert that says 8 out of 10 cats prefer it, so our cat must have it as well. We shrug when we realise or are told that if something's free on social media, you're the commodity and someone's trying to sell you something. But subliminally, we're taking the sell. We fail to be outraged when democracy is hijacked by people sending targeted messages to particular people that influence the way in which they vote. Enough really has to be enough. But here's the dirty secret. We're not so clean ourselves. We can sometimes stand accused of selling the fake news. And I think it's absolutely great that Stephen's going to be giving a tribute to Doug Altman after this presentation. Because Doug was one of those, a beacon who stood up against shoddiness in our practice. The incentives within the publication system to publish articles that make real something that is, rather than an experiment that shows nothing. The incentives to ignore or underplay uncertainty in our findings and make something look clean and pristine and perfect. The temptation to adopt all kinds of questionable research practices. And our current president did a super president's address on this topic last year. We are part of the system. that can sometimes stand accused of shoddiness and the creation of fake news. And in that situation, is it any surprise that people stand up and rail against experts? That's not good enough. Often when we write or when we communicate, we do it in a language which is impenetrable to those people we seek to communicate with. Is it any surprise they don't immediately take our findings and say, wow, these statisticians have done something amazing? In this age of data ubiquity, we hoover up data and use it with great relish. But sometimes we can stand accused of not being careful enough with the confidentiality or security or privacy of the data subjects. The idea of data ethics as a discipline is still in its infancy and needs a lot more work so that we can understand and navigate some fairly treacherous waters between what we should do and what we should not do. We need to stand up and get our own house in order. Now, I think there's some very straightforward ways we can do that. We can, first of all, be much more effective in celebrating the great stuff that we do. When we have a finding, get it out there. Make sure we've got it described really clearly and really crisply. Invest in those around us who can help us communicate. Secondly, don't be suckered into shoddy practices, whatever the incentives are on you to get something out, to get the next publication, to get the next statistical release, whatever it is you do, get the next paper to your board. Stand up for what brought you into this profession in the first place. A care about method and a passion about science and discovery. Don't just be part of the system. So where does that take me when I think about what we need to do as we go forward? I think as a society, first of all, be a society of celebration of statistics and not get worn down by all this agenda around us. Let's make every day a holiday for statisticians. Let us be a society that stands up against fake news whenever we see it. It is corrosive of democracy. It's corrosive of everything we hold dear. And sometimes we don't make as much noise about it as we should. Thirdly, really invest in our own professional practice so that we know what good looks like. And if we see people working in other disciplines who are maybe, to use the name of the article in Significance this month, indulging in cargo cult statistics, where they press a button, p-value with lots of stars, this must be fantastic. Don't just sit in our common rooms or in coffee shops tut-tutting. Go out and help them do better. They want to do better. We have an offer that we can make. But perhaps most of all, and lastly, take a leaf out of H.G. Wells' playbook. Over 100 years ago, H.G. Wells said, one day, statistical thinking will be as essential to being an effective citizen as it is to read and write. That day is today. Thank you very much.